my pleasure to welcome Sergio Oceransky, who will speak a little bit about Chile, neighbor country of Argentina, but also about Mexico, where I understand, Sergio, you are at the moment in Mexico. And first, pleased to hear, I understand that you've just gone through this COVID-19. So we're very happy that you can join us here. Sergio.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Yes, I've also just driven the whole night and I haven't slept at all. So I hope I will make some sense. I don't have a presentation. I just want to, basically present very briefly what the situation is first in Chile and then in Mexico, as you said. Well, in Chile, there's a very interesting situation because, the government is very committed to the transition to renewable energy through there was an agreement between all the major parties, both on the left and on the right, to set up a national energy framework towards 2050, which would be independent of changes in government. This was done in the past, and it was done in a very comprehensive way. And something that was very interesting as part of that was that there was also a very strong discussion on the social dimension of energy, and especially of renewable energy. And this is not surprising because there were already many emerging conflicts since the past, with big dams in the indigenous territories, displacement, and so on and so forth. And the same things were starting to happen with wind and solar projects. So there was a very intense discussion to create a public policy for community energy, and a specific public policy for indigenous community energy in Chile. I was actually involved in those discussions. They were very difficult discussions because the private sector didn't want to hear anything about that. They were very happy to discuss about social benefits. They were very happy to discuss about consultation and agreements with communities and so on and so forth. But they didn't want a policy that promotes communities actually becoming producers of renewable energy. So because of that, the first version of the policies, which were presented to the public in 2015, were actually not ambitious enough. They basically, the private sector managed to get those policies out without touching the legislation. So it was just a matter of public policy, a matter of a statement of will. Because of that, there's a number of projects that would actually be viable, but in the current framework, because of the limitations that there are currently with the system of tenders in Chile and the other mechanisms, they haven't come to fruition yet. But now Chile is in the middle of a periodical review of this 2050 energy framework. And as part of this review, which is done again as a participatory process involving many different sectors of society, there's also a review of all the policies that have to do with community energy as well. So I'm actually quite hopeful in that sense. And Chile also, as a country with very few fossil fuel resources of its own, and understanding that it has very, very strong solar and wind resources, very strong solar in the north, very strong wind in the south, obviously has made a very strong political decision to move in that direction, which is actually moving forward and has realized the importance of involving communities, and in particular indigenous communities, in this as well. So this is the good news of it. Now, moving to Mexico, the situation in Mexico is very interesting. Many of you may have heard that since the change of government, things have changed very much in terms of Mexico's energy policy. I will now do a very quick, very, very, very fast historical kind of overview of what has been happening. Well, first of all, as a background, you have to understand that Mexico's energy policy has since the 1930s, 1940s, there's been a very strong element of nationalizing the energy resources and using the energy resources in order to, to benefit the nation. That happened with the oil sector for a very long time, and this is still very strongly in the minds and the spirit of Mexicans in general. But then, during that time, in addition to oil, I mean, Mexico being an oil exporting country for a very long time, the oil sector was obviously the key sector. But also there was a public state utility. For a very long time, the power sector was 100% publicly owned. And the tariffs were not set by the market, they were set politically, and they still are. There's very subsidized tariffs for, very, very subsidized tariffs for farmers, very subsidized tariffs as well for domestic users that use very little energy, which are normally the poorest sectors. And then there's higher tariffs for other users, including industrial users. So there's a political dimension in how energy prices are set, which has been inherited. I mean, this has been going on for a really long time. But then what happened starting in 1992 was that this system started to change. And the Constitution, the Constitution was later changed in 2015, but already since 1992, a number of laws were brought in that resulted in a process by which two things started happening. On one hand, the power sector started being privatized to the point to which, even before the change of the Constitution, even before, during the time when the Constitution still said that all energy sectors were state monopoly, the private sector already owned 40% of electricity production in Mexico through these new laws. Mainly at the beginning, it was fossil fuels as well. But then there was a big explosion, especially with wind energy, of very, very large projects. Particularly, the first wave of projects were very much concentrated in an indigenous region in southern Mexico, in Oaxaca. And these projects enjoyed extraordinarily high hidden subsidies because they basically didn't pay anything for wheeling the energy. The energy was being produced there in those indigenous regions, but it was being used by large industries all over the country, including in the north. And they didn't pay basically anything for the fact that the energy production was really far away from where they were consuming energy. And in addition, they enjoyed something that is basically equivalent to a kind of net metering system, which basically meant that these consortia made by private companies like Iberdrola or Acciona or Enel on the energy production side, and by large energy consumers, like cement companies and Walmart and what have you, Coca-Cola bottler, the largest Coca-Cola bottler in the world, and so on and so forth. Basically, the energy production was being, the price level was the price that these industrial users were paying before. That's what you had to compete against. You had to lower from that price. But that was a price that was politically set in order to redistribute wealth. So what you ended up having was a system of hidden subsidies that was extremely beneficial for certain corporations, both the corporations on the consuming side, as well as very large energy companies from abroad. So this went on for a very long time, while producing also a lot of social conflicts in the sites where energy was being produced. Particularly in Oaxaca, but not only, also in Yucatan and in many other regions, there's been a lot of cases of land grabs and a lot of social conflict around this. So what happened was that when recently the government changed, there was a new government that came into power, and that came into power very much with an anti-neoliberal agenda. of gaining back public control, particularly in the energy sector. The problem with this new government is that it has the very old mentality of trying to get back to the old times when oil was the basis of, well, of the national economy and certain the welfare of certain sections of society. So it's completely focused on hydrocarbons, which is absolutely terrible. But this also responds to the fact that especially those first wind energy projects that were made, as well as some of the other projects that were done later on the basis of tenders, were actually, on one hand, ripping off indigenous communities and other local communities and creating very negative social impacts. And at the same time, um, enjoying very high hidden subsidies, basically a lot of privileges, and in a very corrupt way, because many many government officials got very high positions in these companies, including a former president is now part of the board of Iberdrola. So basically, the behavior of the sector, and particularly of very large companies, made it very easy to attack the renewable energy sector. Made it very easy to identify renewable energy with, first, the privatization of the power sector, and second, corruption and hidden public subsidies for private gain, as well, of course, as the violation of territorial and collective rights of indigenous communities. So now the situation is a disaster. On the basis of the COVID crisis, the government has, well, even before the COVID crisis, this started, but especially since the COVID crisis, the government has taken this as an opportunity to issue a number of regulations and public policies that go completely against renewable energy. They are using as an excuse the fact that energy consumption went down because of COVID. Because of that, obviously, the share of renewable energies went up. And on the basis of that, using that as an excuse, they've come up with a number of different measures, which are suspended by courts. There's been a lot of litigation around this, and courts have actually suspended many of these measures. But still, the political message has been sent, and there's now a lot of uncertainty in the sector, and a lot of companies that are deciding not to invest in Mexico anymore at all in the energy sector, not only in renewables. For example, Iberdrola, which is the largest private company in the power sector in Mexico, recently announced that it would stop all investments in Mexico, including some investments in thermal company, thermal power stations burning gas. It's not primarily even about renewable energy. But yeah, it's a situation of a lot of uncertainty. Certainly, the government policy is disastrous. What they are going for now is refineries, increasing oil production, which they are not going to succeed because it's not so easy. And also, which is even more worrying, expanding gas pipelines in order to make the entire country dependent on American fracking gas. I mean, the entire North is already depending on imported gas from fracking from the US, but now they are planning to expand a number of new gas pipelines to also make the south of the country dependent on American gas. And that's the main thrust of Mexican public policy right now, as far as electricity is concerned, which is obviously a complete disaster. The problem is that the kind of response that this disastrous policy is receiving from the side of some NGOs in Mexico, as well as from the side of international institutions like IRENA and so on and so forth, is basically to tell the Mexican government, continue doing what previous governments were doing, continue privatizing the power sector, continue granting very good contracts, long-term contracts to private companies, as if this was the only way to conduct the transition to renewable energy. And this is not going to happen, at least with this government. And I personally think it will not happen with future governments either. I think what this whole situation is proving is the need for Mexico to define its own path towards the transition to renewable energy, one that is different from the standard recipe, which involves speeding up the privatization of power sectors in countries where there is still a very strong public power sector that is structured around social objectives, as is the case in Mexico. So I think it's a very interesting situation, actually. I think it's a pity that the kind of analysis that is made of it remains only at the very superficial level of saying, oh, the Mexican government is terrible because it's promoting fossil fuels, which is true. I couldn't agree more to this statement. But it fails to see all the deep mistakes, the terrible mistakes that have been made by the renewable energy sector in Mexico. And I know that it's not only in Mexico, in many other places as well. A lot of what is happening now in Mexico, the sector has brought it upon itself. And nobody, other than a few NGOs that are financed by large American foundations and the private companies themselves, has raised a single finger to defend the energy transition in Mexico because of the disastrous way in which it was done in the past. So now, just to close, what I hope, now there's something that just came out, which is a reason for hope, is that another part of the government, the Council for Science and Technology, has just issued a call for proposals, which has as its main objective to develop new pathways for the transition in Mexico. So in addition to the very terrible parts of the Mexican government that are obsessed about fossil fuels and just want to see fossil fuels, there are other parts of the Mexican government that are trying to find this path towards a different model of transition. And I think that that's where the hope is. But it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be fast. And that is bad news because we urgently need a transition. But yeah, I hope that this process will be possible to speed it up and that we will be seeing, amongst other things, a lot of community projects that are actually also publicly owned because indigenous communities and other rural communities in Mexico are actually part of the state, but are organized in a different way. So yeah, that would be it from my side. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sergio. And that was indeed a very comprehensive presentation of what's going on in Chile. And I'm sure that Chile is now also, there must be also an impact from the decision just taken that there will be a new constitution. And also Mexico. And as usual, you have a very critical eye on the developments. And I think it is indeed very important, your focus on community energy, making sure that the people are those who benefit. And we have also other events. We had previous webinar with a focus on community energy. How is at the moment the concrete prospect of having community wind farms? Is there a delay or is there any prospects of having that? Sergio, we spent together quite some time when I was in Mexico for the MEXIREC conference. And we had some discussions also at that time. Could you just briefly mention, are there any prospects?
Well, the main problem is that there's a lot of people in the Mexican government that are interested in that happening, but the Secretary of Energy isn't. The problem is that basically the Union of Oil Workers has taken over the Secretary of Energy. the secretary, the person, the woman who is Secretary of Energy now in Mexico, she's an oil engineer, and she basically represents the workers of the oil union, which is a very strong and powerful union. And she has absolutely no interest in any form of renewable energy. There are some people in the Secretary of Energy that do have interest, but not her. So, and she's a very centralizing and very, well, complicated person. But I think that with what is happening now with the Council of Science and Technology, that this could be a pathway towards many more projects. I don't know how fast it's going to be to have large-scale community wind farms like the one that we've been working with the community for a very long time in Oaxaca. That would be 102 megawatts. That might take longer, but we're already working in smaller projects. We're, for example, now working on a project of 7 megawatts in Yucatan with the Mayan community. And these kind of projects, I think, will probably go faster. So yeah, I do think there's reason for hope, but it's not all wonderful. I mean, the main problem is actually the Secretary of Energy herself, I'm afraid. And
actually, it sounds familiar to the situation we had in Germany for many years, where the coal mine trade union was very strong and kind of directly had contact to the Minister of Energy at that time. Yeah, so I can understand that is a challenging situation. Let me mention at this point of time, when speaking about community energy, that we've just announced our World Community Power Conference, which will also be held as an online event on 19th of November, which is 3 weeks from now. And the main focus will be on women in community energy. And of course, special invitation to everyone, in particular also now to Sergio, that we'd be happy to hear about the role of women in such projects. Of course, we're now mainly looking for female speakers, when usually we have a male bias, which I think is still fine, because many men are still the pioneers in this sector. But of course, it's very important to kind of increase the scope and social mobilization. So thanks a lot, Sergio.